So let's go in and understand more about the definition-driven approach, right? So APIs have been around for like a long time. It's not just 10 years ago. It's actually APIs have been around before even the PC was created. But if I want to like take a more microscopic view of this, if we want to start from say the early 90s, APIs have primarily been in the SOA-based infrastructure or architecture, right? In the service-oriented architecture, APIs have been around. Then came Salesforce, and in 2000 they kind of like popularized the notion of web APIs. After which e-commerce companies, specifically like eBay and AWS as well as Amazon, the e-commerce giant, they've all like taken really well to APIs. And finally, of course, we saw how social media really took advantage of APIs to like spearhead the platform movement, which essentially allows developers to come in and actually third-party developers to come in and start building additional services and application on top of existing use cases and existing services. And with the big smartphone revolution that came about as well, APIs became incredibly useful and popular to not just have great applications, of course, but also to give you that speed and efficiency which you're so used to right now in an iPhone or like in a Samsung phone. Finally, of course, we're seeing how APIs not just like help in just broader end use cases, but they're also incredibly useful to actually accelerate application development, primarily in microservices. And what if you want to like split the way APIs have been developed, we can actually take like the 90s to early 2000s approach of APIs, and just look at what the objectives were when you were kind of building APIs in that timeline, in that period of time. And over there, it was more of a very data-driven approach, right? They want if you were a developer at that time, you were primarily building out an API with specific data objective in mind. You wanted to transfer data between different services, and that's why you built out the API. And these APIs were modeled canonically. And all the nomenclature, the nomenclature, the descriptions which you've used were very cryptic in the sense that they just use the same nomenclature as you would in a data set, very technical jargon, very industry domain focused jargon, which was not really, it wasn't really built for, I guess, reusability or long-term scalability. And finally, of course, no documentation, and would be lucky if you had good documentation for APIs. Again, because APIs were never actually, as a concept or as a technology framework, there was never an implication of how you could actually help in long-term sustainability of your applications or your services. But now we're seeing there's a big revolution that's happening, and I'll be talking about three important trends that validate why it's so important for you to change your approach towards API development. Um, the first one is companies are now entering the platform ecosystem. We saw that in the social media age, but now we're actually seeing large enterprises, B2B companies, all opening up their products with third-party APIs to essentially transform their products into platforms. And when I say platforms, it's essentially allowing developers, maybe internal or external developers, to add on top of your existing services and extend upon them, right? When we're seeing so many people actually take up the platform economy. And platforms have actually, if you look at the entire timeline of how much revenue was driven by the internet in general, platforms actually account for the majority of this. They are the major drivers of revenue and economic growth when it comes to the internet. And this is the reason why a lot of these organizations, or even like small teams, are trying to take advantage of the platform economy that we're living in. And platforms are primarily driven by APIs. APIs are the foundation of the platform economy. And the second trend we're seeing is there's this API first approach. Now, in the API, what do I mean by an API first approach? Well, to understand the API first approach, let's take the example of a monolith. Traditionally, when you build out your application, you would start with understanding what the plan was, and from there you'd build out the database, right? And then after you build out the database, your different backend teams will start building out the business logic, the in finer granular modules, which will eventually get consumed by the front-end clients. And the front-end teams will work on that. Now here the problem is that one is you have to have so many dependencies between each level to even get the application to its final state. right? And this is in an era where we're increasingly seeing companies becoming more agile and more quicker, and having better go-to-market strategies, and consumers demanding more from companies. This approach is not scalable, and it's not really optimal for speed and efficiency to push features to the market. So in the API first approach, you actually start out with an API layer. Understanding once you have a clear idea of the plan, you actually start out with the API interface, and actually mock out for each of these interfaces what is the data that you would be showing or giving by each of these APIs. And from there, once you have your APIs in place, and because you have mock data that gets transferred between each of these APIs, you have your front-end teams and your back-end teams all working simultaneously with each other to essentially build out that service, right? So there's no actual real dependency, because once you have an API or a contract, that actually defines what the arrangement is between the back-end and the front-end team. So in the API first approach as well, it's like APIs are the primary elements of your product and service strategy. And this is actually a real life use case, right? We see companies like Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, all adopting APIs as a primary change agent within the organization to accelerate development and pushing features faster, pushing new updates faster to market. And finally, the biggest trend is the explosion of the API economy. We're seeing that so many organizations are now investing in an API strategy. There are over 100,000 publicly available APIs for consumption, and 85% of enterprises are estimated to enter the API economy, to have invested in an API strategy by 2018. That is just enough reason for all of us to start thinking about how can we best leverage APIs to accelerate our development. So this is not just public APIs when we talk about the platform economy, but it's also even internal private APIs. And the core of all of this is we're seeing these three different trends actually affecting the way we think about APIs, because the modern API is no longer data driven. It's actually consumer driven. Even if you have, it makes so much sense if it's a public API, but a lot of people might be thinking, well, if I have a private API, why do I have to think about this? Well, even if it's a private API, you want to build APIs for long-term sustainability. That means you'll have so many different internal stakeholders all consuming this API. And so they need to have an easy way to understand what this API does. They need to be thinking about how you can discover this APIs. You need to be thinking about long-term sustainability of how this API touches on various parts of your system. So it's not data driven, and it's not built for short-term goals. It's built for long-term, consumer-driven, tactical strategy that the modern API tries to satisfy. The modern API is also staged for self-service development and consumption. So in an ideal world, you should give an API to someone, you should hand over the API to someone, and they should be in enough position to just look at the API and reach success with that API. The modern API is also built to enable speed of updating and maintaining not just your own internal applications, but also allowing third-party services to consume it. And finally, the modern API has a common vocabulary. You have so many different programming languages in the world that are coming up. JavaScript is always something new happening in that world, right? There's so many different technology stacks available. Your APIs, if you're building it for long-term sustainability, should not impose limitations for different people consuming it in terms of technology stack. So if I built in service in PHP, I should not be imposing restrictions saying, hey, the other person should also be consuming this in PHP for them to be successful. It has to have a common vocabulary of consumption. So the modern web API is just based on reusable HTTP standards, and it's built for consumer demand and for self-service consumption.